In this tutorial, I'm going to break down the making of this VFX shot, inspired by the 2021 movie Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings by Marvel Studios. In the raw footage for this shot, I have a brief moment where the rings are meant to be on the forearm, followed by some playing around with them as they orbit the body, followed by a final bit where they come to rest hovering above my hand. All the visible parts of my body are always in front of the plain white wall behind me. This is important because that wall is going to act like a green screen, which is key to making this whole thing work. It's also a static camera shot, which simplifies the task as well. I'm going to assume you're already familiar with a lot of Blender basics. I'm also going to assume that you've got the Node Wrangler add-on enabled. Incidentally, I'm using Blender 2.83. To begin, I've got my raw footage already converted to an image sequence, ready to be used as inputs. Okay, create a new project file, delete the default cube and the default light. Under Render Properties, set the render engine to cycles, samples to 128, enable motion blur, and under Film, check transparency, and under Color Management, set the view transform to standard. Select the camera, go to Object Data Properties, enable background images, and load the raw footage so we can see it in the background whenever we look through the camera. Orient the camera so it faces in the direction of the positive y-axis, and move it back and away from the world origin a bit. Here are the settings I use to do that. Next, go to World Properties and load in an HDRI that vaguely matches your scene. It doesn't have to be perfect. And under Ray Visibility, uncheck Camera. I'm not going to explain how the rings themselves were made. I'm just going to assume that you're already familiar enough with Blender to model something like this. In case you're not though, I'll add a link in the description to a couple of tutorials showing how others have made theirs. We're going to make a false arm that will be our virtual counterpart to the real arm that wears the rings. This will be a fairly imperfect 3D model of the forearm, but it will have three main purposes. It's going to block the view from parts of the ring that shouldn't be seen because there's an arm in the way. It's going to catch shadows that are cast by the rings, so we can add those shadows to the real arm in the raw footage. And lastly, it's going to be reflected in the shiny metal rings to help them blend more realistically with the scene. Start by making a cylinder. Place it roughly where it aligns with the forearm. Add a subdivision surface modifier, a couple of edge loops, and then apply the modifier. We just want something roughly forearm shaped, and with some geometry we can use to more closely match the real arm. You can use proportional editing in edit mode to push and pull this shape until it lines up with the outline of the forearm. Under Object Properties and View Display, you can display the arm as a wireframe to make this easier. Don't worry about making a perfect forearm shape. Worry more about the outline matching when seen from the camera's point of view. Create a material for the false arm. Let's call it arm skin. We can just use the raw footage to paint our false arm so that it looks exactly like the real arm when seen from the camera's point of view. Just add an image texture node to pull in the raw footage as an image sequence. Feed it into the base color input of a principled BSDF. Let's set roughness up to maximum so it won't appear to be shiny, and use a texture coordinate node to map the image using window coordinates. This will paint the forearm with the colors of the real forearm as seen from the camera's point of view. Go to the object properties of the new false arm, and under Visibility enable Shadow Catcher. This will make our false arm capture shadows that are cast onto it, and those shadows will be rendered on top of the real footage later in the compositor. Move the rings onto the false arm so we can observe shadows being cast. Don't worry about the exact positioning of the rings for now, just roughly in the position of the arm is fine. The particular HDRI that I used didn't result in very obvious shadows on the arm, so I added a sunlight into the scene in order to make the shadows a little more prominent. You can play with the strength and angle values of the sun in order to tweak the look of the shadows, as well as tinkering with the orientation of the sun in the scene. The result may not be physically realistic, but I felt like the shot needed more obvious shadows, so this is how I made that happen. Next, let's go to the compositor and combine the 3D objects and shadows we've made with the raw footage. We want to use an image node to pull in the raw footage, and we'll combine it with the output of the render layers node using an alpha over node. The alpha output of the render layers will be the factor input for the alpha over node, and we can render out the current frame to see how it looks. Now let's begin the process of having the false arm move and stay aligned with the real arm. First, we'll just keyframe its movement. We'll lose our perfectly lined up outline by doing this, but don't worry, we'll be addressing that problem with shape keys in a minute. This only needs to be done up to the point where the rings have left the arm. Once the false arm is no longer needed, keyframe Show in Renders under Object Properties and Visibility. Keyframe it enabled, and then disable one frame later. We want the false arm and the real arm to stay lined up for the sake of the shadow catcher's shadows. We'll use shape keys to do it. Again, this is fairly forgiving. It's more important to have the edges of the arms line up from the camera's point of view, and not so important that the false arm is changing shape in physically or biologically unrealistic ways. This is just for the sake of catching shadows and works perfectly fine for that purpose. Do the following. Go back to the first frame and then under Object Data Properties, add a base shape key. Then move forward frame by frame, and when the false arm doesn't align with the real arm, make a new shape key that's a copy of the most recent one. Use proportional editing of vertices in edit mode to make it align with the real arm, and then keyframe the new shape key going from a value of 0 to a value of 1. And on the same two frames, keyframe the previous shape key going from 1 down to 0. And then rinse and repeat until the false arm is no longer needed. Now let's connect the rings to the false arm. I did this by parenting each ring to a kind of control empty, and then parenting the empties to the arm. You can do the same thing just by parenting the rings directly to the arm, but I'm going to describe how I did it. Make sure the origin of each ring is at its center. Under Object, choose Set Origin and Origin to Geometry. Create an empty at the origin of each ring. Select the ring. Under Object, choose Snap and Cursor to Selected. Add an empty. Personally, I like sphere-shaped empties most of the time, but any empty will do. And if you need to scale the empty, don't forget to apply the scale, which is under Object, Apply, Scale. Make the false arm the parent of the empty, and make the empty the parent of the ring. Now the rings follow the arm as it moves, but they're not fitting snugly on the arm, and they won't appear to move perfectly with the arm. We'll address both of those issues. Let's make the rings fit snugly around the arm, and let's have them fly off the arm and away from the body. On frame 1, adjust the size of each ring to roughly fit the arm. I'm using Transformation Orientation Local to be sure I'm scaling the rings along the proper axes or dimensions. I don't want to adjust the ring thickness, only the diameter. In my case, that means I'll be scaling in the X and Y dimensions, but not the Z dimension. The hotkeys for that are S for scaling and Shift-Z to scale in X and Y only. You don't want the rings intersecting the front of the false arm, at least not in an obvious way, so this resizing doesn't strictly need to be done from the camera's point of view. You can move around freely and see what you're doing from whatever orientation you want. Keyframe the location and scale after you've resized each ring. Keyframe the control empties to have each ring fly off the arm, past the hand and away from the body. We'll adjust this later to have them orbit around the body. Keyframe the X and Y scale values of the rings as they exit the arm, so that they become large enough to let the hand pass through them, but then return to normal size a short time later. Normal here means X, Y, and Z scale values all return to 1.0. The rings already follow the arm, but they drift around a little and don't appear to be properly stuck to the arm. You can tackle this by manually tweaking the location of each ring's control empty, frame by frame. It's not perfect, but it barely lasts a few seconds in the video. In my original version, the result looked like this. We're going to create a little complex of parented and keyframed empties that will produce the locations and orientations of the rings as they orbit the body. Then we're going to use copy location constraints to smoothly transition the rings from their keyframed motion away from the body into their orbit positions. But first, it might be worth a quick explanation of the copy location constraint in case you're not familiar. Here we've got 3 different empties following 3 different motion paths. The one on the right is moving up and down, the one on the left is moving in a circle, and the one at the bottom is moving around randomly. We've also got a Suzanne monkey head that is parented to the empty that is moving up and down, so it moves up and down as well. The Suzanne has 2 copy location constraints. The first one is pointing at the empty that's moving in a circle, the second one is pointing at the empty that's moving randomly, but both of them have an influence value of 0. When the influence value is 0, the copy location constraint does nothing at all. So let's see what happens when we change those influence values. You can see that the Suzanne moves from its parent empty to the empty moving in a circle as we drag the influence from 0 to 1. If we then play with the influence value of the second constraint, we can see the Suzanne moves over to follow the position of the randomly moving empty. Since influence values, just like almost everything else in Blender, can be keyframed, we can have our Suzanne transition between these 3 different movement patterns according to whatever schedule we'd like. We're going to use copy location constraints just like this to smoothly transition our floating rings between 3 different phases of their movement in the video. The first phase is where the rings are moving off the arm and away from the body. The second phase is where the rings are orbiting around the body. And the third phase is where the rings settle into position floating above my hand. We already have the first phase of movement where the rings are moving off the arm and away from the body. So let's create the second phase where they orbit the body. And we'll do that with a little setup of parented and keyframed empties. First, let's create 5 empties that will represent the actual locations of the rings. We can position them off to the side and a little bit back from where the false arm is. Once we create one, we create the other 4 by duplication, leaving them all in the same location for now. Let's call these the orbit location empties. We want these 5 empties to orbit around a common center point, but we want them to start off bunched up, orbiting together, and then spread out until they're evenly spaced around the body. To do this, we're going to create 5 more empties where we want the center of the orbit to be, and we're going to make each one a parent of one of the orbit location empties. Let's refer to these as the spread out empties, because their job is to control the orbit location empties going from a bunched up configuration to an evenly spread out configuration. I've placed the spread out empties off to the side here instead of at the location that would correspond to my body. I want the rings to be moving in an arc that's a little off to one side, and then I want them to pull back into a slightly tighter orbit that is properly centered on my body. We'll get there in a minute. First, let's use these new empties to have the orbit location empties start in a bunched up configuration and then spread out evenly through a full 360 degrees. First, rotate these new empties around the z-axis, one of them by -12 degrees, the next one by -9 degrees, then -6 degrees, -3 degrees, and the last one 0 degrees. They're still bunched up, but separated from each other at least a tiny bit. Let's keyframe those Z rotation values roughly at the moment when the rings are almost finished exiting the false arm. Incidentally, the specific timing, position, angles, keyframing, etc. that I'm using here, this was just a result of me spending some time playing around with different values until I found something that I liked. Obviously, if you attempt to duplicate this effect, your raw footage, camera angle, environment, and so on will all be different from mine. So don't feel like you need to mimic this tutorial absolutely precisely. Now let's spread the orbit location empties out so they're evenly distributed around the full 360 degrees. We're going to have this spreading out action occur at the same time as the orbit pulls sideways to be centered on the body instead of off to the side. We're also going to have the orbit tighten a little as well. The way that this is set up, the x location values of the orbit location empties determine the radius of the orbit. Let's keyframe those x values now, and we'll keyframe them again in a moment for a tighter orbit. Keyframe the locations of the spread out empties as well. We'll jump ahead a bit in the shot and move the spread out empties into a position that roughly corresponds to the center of my body. And then we'll change the separation between the orbit locations from 3 degrees to 72 degrees. We're choosing 72 degrees because that's 1/5 of 360 degrees, so the 5 rings will spread out perfectly evenly. So select the spread out empty with the -12 degrees as its Z rotation angle and change it to 0 degrees. Then change the one at -9 degrees to 72 degrees, and then change the -6 degrees to 72 times 2 degrees. The -3 degrees becomes 72 times 3, and finally the last one becomes 72 times 4 degrees. Finally, let's tighten the orbit by reducing the x values of the orbit location empties and keyframe those changes. Just by spreading out like this, they're already moving in a circular motion, but I don't want to use these specific 5 empties to keep that motion going. I'd rather use a single new one. So let's add that empty where the orbit center should be, and make it the parent of all the spread out empties. Let's call it the orbit center empty. Here's a quick cleanup. Because we've keyframed the locations of the spread out empties and then later parented them to the orbit center empty, we've disrupted the way they were meant to move. Meh, no big deal. Just clean up the keyframes so that the spread out empties only have rotation keyframes and the orbit center empty is the one that changes location. With that out of the way, we can keyframe the Z rotation value of the orbit center empty, just as the orbit location empties are about to be fully spread out. Then we can jump far ahead and keyframe it again with a large Z rotation value. Play around with that value to find an orbit speed that you like. Later in the shot, we're going to have the rings speed up and slow down again, but we won't handle that just yet. Now that we've got some orbiting motion going on, let's add one more empty that will allow us to tilt the plane of the orbit so that it doesn't have to be strictly horizontal. Let's make it a cube-shaped empty to easily distinguish it from the previous one. Make it the parent of the previous one. We'll use it later to tilt the orbiting rings. At this point, we're done setting up all of the empties that will control the orbiting rings. Now we can return to those copy location constraints we described earlier. Just after the rings leave the arm, we want to use a copy location constraint on each ring to have it smoothly transition into its orbiting configuration. Select the first ring to come off the arm and give it a copy location constraint, where the target is the frontmost orbit location empty, and set its influence to 0. Then add a constraint linking the second ring to the second empty in the same way, and so on, linking each ring to the corresponding empty. Now it's just a matter of keyframing the influence values at 0 as each ring exits the arm, and at 1 as each ring should be fully transitioned into the orbit motion. Keep in mind where the body would be in the scene to avoid having the rings touch it. With a little tinkering, you should be able to find a decent looking setup where the rings fly off the arm and arc around into an orbit around the body. As the rings float around in the air, I want them to spin on all axes, sort of independently of each other, instead of being locked into the sort of rigid-looking orientation they've got now. We'll do that by keyframing the X, Y, and Z rotation angles of each ring. We'll keyframe them at their existing values just as they're entering into the orbit around the body, and then we'll jump ahead in the shot to the moment when the rings should start coming out of orbit and moving to their hovering position above my hand. At that point in the shot, I'm setting and keyframing the X, Y, and Z rotation angles of each ring to some large numbers that are all different from ring to ring, but roughly in the same magnitude range. In my case, for reference, the gap between the rings starting to orbit and the rings starting to come out of orbit is about 300 frames, and I found that setting the X, Y, and Z rotation angles to random values between 1500 degrees and 2300 degrees resulted in the kind of spinning I had in mind. As with everything else, you'll need to play around with the timing and the values of these keyframes to find something you like. A couple of times in the shot, I gesture as if to make the rings orbit faster, and at a bit of an angle. The cube-shaped empty can be used to tilt the orbit, and by keyframing the Z rotation angle of the orbit center empty, I can have the rings speed up or slow down in their orbit. At the end of the shot, I hold out one hand and have the rings come to rest floating above it. This is just a matter of placing an empty where each ring should come to rest, and using one more copy location constraint on each ring to transition from orbiting motion to resting place, the same way that copy location constraints were used before. Because the rings are spinning while they're orbiting, I had to tweak and keyframe their rotation angles so that they come to rest in a horizontal position. Now that all the ring motion is in place, we can turn our attention to the compositor where we can separate my body from the rest of the scene. This is important because sometimes we want the rings to appear to pass behind me and sometimes in front of me depending on where they are in space. Being able to separate me from the background is necessary to make that happen. We're going to get the compositor to basically treat the wall behind me like a green screen. It's not green, but the particular combinations of red, green, and blue that make up the wall colors are different from the combinations found in the color of my skin, clothes, hair, etc. Same goes for the particular combinations of hue, saturation, and value. In the compositor, we can separate colors into these components and use them to distinguish pixels of me from pixels of the wall. What I'm about to describe might be doable in other ways, possibly even simpler ways, and feel free to comment if you know other ways to accomplish this, but I'm going to describe the method that I used. Looking at the end result in terms of separating my body from the background, I think it worked fairly well. Open the compositor and use a separate HSVA node to split the colors of the pixels from the raw footage into their hue, saturation, and value numbers. Connect a color ramp node to each of those three component outputs and set their interpolation modes to constant. Now visit each color ramp one by one and see if you can find a setup where the only white pixels present are on the body, and the wall in the background stays black. It's alright if some of the body remains black, as long as the wall isn't white. You can get away with a few white pixels on the walls here and there, but try to keep that to a minimum. Don't worry about the hallway, the ceiling, the bicycle, etc. We can handle all those later with a simple mask. Also, be sure to jump around to different frames in the raw footage. just in case the color ramp setup you found only works for the particular frame that you happen to be looking at. You want it to work for all the frames, even if that means a little bit less of the body is represented by the white pixels. Do this separately for each of the color ramps. If you can't find a setup that works for a particular color ramp, just delete that color ramp. We only want to keep the ones where we can isolate the pixels of the body. In the same way that you split the raw footage into hue, saturation, and value, do the same with a separate RGBA node, and repeat the process for color ramps connected to the red, green, and blue color components. The next step is to combine the outputs from all the color ramps together. Use math nodes that are set to the maximum function, like this. Take a look at the final maximum node that combines all the color ramps together. With any luck, the entire body will be represented as white pixels. In my case, there were a few small areas that remained black. Simple animated masks can be used to fix those spots. You might be wondering why I didn't just use animated masks for the whole body from the beginning. The reason is that a tiny mask meant to plug a small hole here is much easier to do than full-blown masking and rotoscoping of the entire body. I'm going to assume that you're already familiar with creating masks like that in Blender, but in case you're not, I'll put a link in the description to some tutorials on YouTube that explain it. Once I'd made a mask that covered the bicycle, the ceiling, the hallways, and all the extra bits of the background like that, I used a math node to subtract that mask from the output of the final maximum node. If you do this, make sure that you enable clamp on the subtract node to prevent it from outputting negative values. After that, you can use more maximum nodes to pull in any animated masks you created to fill in remaining gaps in the body. The end result should be a nice clean separation of the body from the background. As a final touch, tack on a dilate erode node to soften the harsh boundaries. I found that a feather mode with a distance of -3 and a smooth fall off worked well. Now that the compositor has what it needs to distinguish the body from everything else, let's start using that information to allow the rings to pass behind the body. We're going to do this by rendering out a version of the entire shot, showing the rings only when they're further from the camera than I am, i.e. only showing the rings when they're roughly behind me. In that version of the shot, we'll have the compositor hide any parts of the rings that would be blocked from view by my body. First, go to Output Properties and choose an output folder for the frames that we're going to generate here. Now let's use a large block-shaped cutter object and Boolean modifiers to hide anything in the scene that's closer to the camera than I am. Add a cube to the scene, let's call it Cutter. In Object Properties, under Viewport Display, have it display as wireframe. Then also in Object Properties, under Ray Visibility, uncheck all the checkboxes. Scale and move the cutter so it covers everything in the scene, but only from roughly the center of where the body would be in the scene and forward toward the camera. There are only 6 visible objects in the scene, and we want the cutter to affect all of them. Select the false arm and give it a Boolean modifier, pointing at the cutter and using the difference operation. This will hide any part of the false arm that's inside the cutter. In this case, that's the whole arm for the entire shot, but that's working as intended. Then do exactly the same thing with each of the 5 rings. With these Boolean modifiers in place, we have non-destructively isolated the scene to show only objects or parts of objects that are further from the camera than the body. Let's go back to the compositor and make final preparations for this first sequence of frames we're going to render. Our Render Layers node already has an alpha output. If you view it, you can see that it's white wherever our visible 3D objects appear and black everywhere else. We can subtract our information about the location of the body from that alpha output using a math node with the subtract function. Don't forget to enable clamping. The result shows us which parts of the rendered rings shouldn't be obscured from view by the body. We can use that as the factor input for the alpha over node to combine our rendered rings with the raw footage. With this setup in place, we render out the entire scene as an image sequence into our output folder. Now we're ready to insert the final missing piece. We want to reverse the effect of our Boolean cutter, so that everything closer to the camera than my body will be rendered and everything further away will not. And we want that render to be superimposed on top of the frames that we just generated. The result should be rings that appear to pass in front and behind the body correctly as they orbit around. Go to Output Properties again and change the output folder to a new directory so we don't clobber the image sequence we just made. Go to all 6 of the Boolean modifiers we created earlier and change them from the difference operation to the intersect operation. Now go to the compositor and create the following simple node setup. Add an image node that points at that sequence of images we generated where the rings are behind the body. Use an alpha over node to combine that with the output from the render layers node, using the alpha output as the factor. This will render our 3D objects on top of the images we rendered before. I have to warn you, using Boolean modifiers in this way works great for most frames. But you may notice a small handful of frames produce glitches like you see here. These occur when a ring is partially inside the cutter and partially outside the cutter. Again, most frames like this don't have a problem, but a few of them might. The fix I found for this was to move the cutter a little further from the camera or a little closer, and then go back and visit just those specific frames and render them again. Once for the image sequence where the rings only show when they're behind the back, and once for the final sequence. Congratulations for making it this far. I know it was a lot to digest and more than a little messy. I hope you found this useful though. Have a good one.